Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Tuesday, March the 11th. And welcome to our commentary. Just a quick note. You may have heard about this representative or former representative, former Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart, who represented South Florida for a long time. I think he may have been the first Cuban American congressman in the United States, passed away, I guess, a few days ago of cancer. He had served in the Congress for about 20 years. I believe his brother is also in the Congress, and he comes from a very interesting Cuban family. Just a couple of quick things about his family in Cuba. His father, Rafael Diaz-Balart, back in the 1950s, opposed the amnesty that was supposed to be given or was given to then Fidel Castro, who was in jail. And then after that amnesty, Batista ordered that amnesty. After that amnesty, Batista flew to Mexico, and then he came back to Cuba, and you know the rest of the story. And then his other connection to Fidel Castro is that his aunt, Mirta, was actually married to Fidel Castro. So the Diaz-Balart family and the Castro family have met along the way. But a very good man, Lincoln Diaz-Balart, good congressman, and again, rest in peace. We send our best to his family and all of his constituents down in Miami, Florida. Well, let's begin with Ukraine. Apparently, there is a ceasefire. At least Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire. And look, I'm delighted to hear that. I think there has to be a ceasefire. I don't. Well, there has to be an end to this war, some kind of a negotiated settlement. This war is not going anywhere, and neither side is going to win. Even though, again, I've always said the same thing. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine, and the Ukraine soldiers and armed forces have fought very bravely. And I don't know how bravely the Russians have fought. Let's give them credit, maybe bravely. But certainly the Russians have demonstrated that their army is not that good. When you have to get help from 10,000 North Koreans, you're probably not doing very well. But anyway, this war has to come to an end, and I hope it does. I hope it does, because it's been a senseless war. Lots of people gotten killed, and as I said, Russia is never going to dominate Ukraine, and Ukraine is never going to drive them out. So there has to be some kind of a negotiated settlement so that the shooting can at least stop, and Ukraine can go back to being, a country with borders that Russia respects. I'm also glad that our mineral deal is going to go into effect. That's going to mean a lot to Ukraine. That's going to bring money and a little prosperity to Ukraine. So let's hope that both sides can agree to something here, and that the war can come to an end. It's been an absolutely senseless war, and at the moment, it's nothing but a stalemate. As I say, nobody is going to win. But just a quick note: you may have heard a few weeks ago that the Philadelphia Eagles were not going to go to the White House. Well, now it turns out that they've accepted an invitation to the White House, for winning the Super Bowl. I think that whole story was a lie to begin with, and it got blown out of proportion in the internet. But usually the team that wins these championships goes to the White House. It's a tradition going back quite a few years. And when I first heard the story that the Eagles were not going to go, I didn't believe it. And it turned out that it was not true, that the Eagles are going to go to the White House. And I'm sure they'll have a lot of fun. They'll have a lot of fun doing that. Well, the tariff war between the United States and Canada took sort of an interesting twist today. The Premier of Ontario said that he was going to increase the electricity rates of many households in the United States and Minnesota, New York, and Michigan. About 1 million people, I guess, get their electricity because of Canada, or comes from Canada. And when the Trump administration heard about this, they went back and put a even bigger tariff on Canada. And then the Premier of Ontario, they call him Premier instead of governors up there. The Premier of Ontario went back, stepped back a little bit, and hopefully this is the last time we see this back and forth going on between the two countries. Look, we can settle this with Canada relatively easy. It's not that complicated with Canada, but there's a couple of things that have to happen. Number one, Canada is going to have to contribute more to NATO. They've gotten away with contributing less than the 2% required, and they've got to put more money. They have to invest more money in their defense, and they need to start doing that because the threat from China and just overall, they need to do a better job of funding their NATO programs. And the other thing that we have to do is work out some kinks. There are some things like agricultural products or dairy products that need to be negotiated, maybe the lumber, and just work out some of that. It's not huge. It can be negotiated, and we can get back to normal situation with Canada. I mean, look, we're good friends. They're good neighbors, but they have to pay more for their defense. I think that they've grown accustomed to the Americans protecting them, and that is simply not going to continue. That's just the way it is. Well, the education department is apparently in for a surprise. A lot of people are getting their layoff notices. Something like half of the employees are getting layoff notices. Now, before you feel sorry for these people, it's not like they're going to be thrown out in the streets. Most of them will get a pretty decent amount of money to leave. They'll probably get a salary for 6 months, and including health insurance and everything else. They'll probably get a lot of help looking for a job. So it's not like, they're going to be out in the street the next day, as often happens in the private sector. So it's not going to be that kind of a termination. But, look, we have to bring down, we have to eliminate the education department. I mean, I've never understood why we need a federal education department. This goes back to the Carter administration, and I remember when it happened. And again, I'll tell you, I never understood why we need a federal education department. We don't need one. We've got 50 education departments in the states, and that's where it should be. Education should be at the state level. That's where it should be, not in Washington. There's nothing that Washington can do to support education at the state level. Now, if there's a case of discrimination or something like that, yeah, Washington can intervene. They can do that through the Department of Justice. But the fact is that we also have justice departments and attorney generals in the states to handle cases like that. The whole idea of discrimination is sort of rooted in the 50s and the 40s, and we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a totally different world right now. You got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You have other legislation since. So if there's a case of discrimination based on race or religion or whatever, it can be handled at the state level, and the Department of Justice can be involved. But we do not need a Department of Education at the federal level. It should be terminated, and the employees provided some kind of a package so that they, go to the private sector or go wherever they want to go and get themselves another job. We remember on this day in history for a quick second. I don't know how many of you remember back in 2004 when those trains exploded in Madrid. It became a real turning point in Spanish politics. About 200 people were killed, and the Spanish government then reacted by pulling troops out of Iraq, and it became a real controversial thing. Obviously, the terrorists did not leave Spain, but the Spanish troops did leave Iraq. As it turned out, it was just a very bad day for Spain, but it did allow the left to win the election by exploiting this terrible incident and blaming it on the Iraq War, when in fact it had nothing to do with the Iraq War, but that's what they did. And of course, we today remember Lawrence Welk. When we first came to the United States, my parents were huge fans of Lawrence Welk. And he had a TV show. I think it was at 6:30 every Saturday night. And I remember my mom would be cooking, getting the table ready, and Lawrence Welk was on TV. My father used to love Lawrence Welk, his music and so on. And I just remember that growing up and having Lawrence Welk on the TV every Saturday night at 6:30. This is before cable TV, before, I guess, what we have now, streaming or whatever. This was, I guess they called those syndicated back then. But Lawrence Welk became, a real popular guy. He had a band, and they would play these very traditional songs, and they appealed to people in my parents' generation. That was their market. And every Saturday night, there he was on TV, and my parents were watching. And that's my memory of Lawrence Welk, who was born on this day in 1903, passed away in 1992. He was born in North Dakota and became a very famous orchestra leader. I mean, huge, very famous. And that show every Saturday night, a lot of people came out of that show. I mean, many of the dancers and many of the artists who were on the organist, I remember, or the accordion player, Myron, I think was his name. He came out of that show, and lots of people became very popular. Some of the dancers became very popular. I remember they had a young Mexican woman who would sing songs in Spanish, and of course, my parents loved that. So Lawrence Welk, it brings me back lots of memories from those early days in the United States and Saturday nights on TV at 6:30 while my mom was getting dinner ready and my dad was sitting there waiting for dinner, and we were all kind of waiting for dinner. Lawrence Welk was on TV. Great memory. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.